She was invisible to them, just the quiet black girl who cleaned their bats, organized their gear, and swept their dugout without complaint. Aaliyah Brooks had spent 3 months being looked through by an entire baseball program, by the coaches, the scouts, the golden boys who never once wondered what she knew or what she carried, or whose hands had taught her how to read a hitter before she was old enough to understand what reading a hitter meant. But the moment she opened her mouth in that dugout, one quiet sentence, no raised voice, no anger, everything changed. They laughed. They recorded it. They waited for her to shrink. And that was the last mistake Harrington Academy ever made. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The thing about Harrington Academy was that it didn't just produce baseball players. It produced a certain kind of baseball player, the kind with legacy behind their name, connections woven into the fabric of sport, and a built-in sense that the field had always belonged to them. Walk through those iron gates on any given afternoon, and you'd see it immediately. The way the boys moved with that comfortable confidence, the way the coaches spoke to scouts and agents like old friends, the way everything about the place hummed with expectation and entitlement in equal measure. Harrington's baseball program had been running for 41 years. In that time, it had sent 17 players to the majors and produced 2 World Series winners. Its trophy cases stretched the entire length of the main corridor, and the school had repainted its team colors, navy and gold, on practically every surface that stood still long enough. The program wasn't just part of Harrington. It was Harrington in a way that mattered to the people who funded it, promoted it, and sent their sons to be shaped by it. The field itself was something else. Regulation dimensions, professional-grade turf, lighting rigs that made night practice look like afternoon. There were 2 batting cages behind the left field fence, a fully equipped weight room beneath the main bleachers, and a clubhouse that most college programs would have envied. It was the kind of facility built by people who wanted results and who expected them without question. What made Harrington work, or what made it appear to work, was also what made it difficult to breathe inside. The culture was old, not old in a wise or seasoned way, but old in the way that certain things harden over decades and stop being examined. There was a hierarchy that everyone understood without it ever being spoken aloud. Players who came from money, from baseball families, from the right networks, they moved through that world easily. Everyone else carved out whatever space they could and tried not to draw the wrong kind of attention. Aaliyah Brooks had been drawing the wrong kind of attention her whole life without meaning to. Not because she was loud or difficult or disruptive. If anything, she was the opposite. But she was a 17-year-old black girl working part-time in the clubhouse of an elite, legacy-obsessed baseball program, and that alone made her visible in a way that she often wished she wasn't. She'd started the job 3 months before the season began. Her mother had arranged it through a neighbor who did groundskeeping for the school, a quiet favor, a small income, something to help with the tightening of things at home since her father passed. Aaliyah had taken it without complaint. The work was straightforward enough. She cleaned bats, organized equipment, kept the gear bag sorted and the shelves stocked. She swept the dugout before and after practice, laundered the training towels, and made sure the water coolers were filled and cold before the team arrived. She was good at making herself small. It was a skill she developed without noticing. The ability to move through a space without disrupting it, to complete the work and step back into the edges before anyone thought to look her way. The players barely registered her presence most of the time. She was furniture, background, part of the clubhouse the same way the equipment racks were, useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time. But invisibility, for Aaliyah, was never the same as absence. While she worked, she watched. Not obviously, she was careful about that, but consistently. She'd catch the tail end of a pitching session through the equipment room window and find herself breaking down the mechanics in her head before she even realized she was doing it. She'd clean along the dugout bench after practice and find herself studying the pitch charts that had been left out on the bench, her fingers tracing the spray patterns, her mind already calculating where the sequences had broken down and why. Late some evenings, When the field was empty and the light was dropping low, she'd stand at the edge of the mound and go through the motions slowly. Not with a ball, just with her arm, working through the mechanics like a meditation. She never asked anyone to watch. She never talked about it. It was just something she did, the way some people run through music in their heads or replay old conversations. A kind of private, constant practice that lived entirely inside of her. In her locker at home, tucked beneath a stack of school books and an old photograph, there was a baseball glove. Worn leather, the stitching repaired twice, the name DB written inside the cuff in permanent marker. Her father's glove. Darnell Brooks had given it to her on her 9th birthday with a seriousness that surprised her at the time, not as a toy or a keepsake, but as a tool handed over with instruction. He had taught her how to grip a seam, how to read a hitter's stance, how to think about the space between catcher and batter, not as a distance, but as a conversation. She hadn't known then what she understood now, that her father had been exceptional. Not just good, not just talented. Exceptional in the way that certain players are exceptional, the ones who change the math of a game just by being in it. He had pitched semi-professionally for 6 years before something happened that Aaliyah only understood in pieces. A contract that fell through, a coach who closed doors, a version of the baseball world that decided a man like her father didn't fit the image they were selling. He'd come home quieter every year after that. He'd stopped talking about pitching, then stopped watching it, then stopped mentioning it altogether. But he had never stopped teaching her. She hadn't fully understood why until she was standing in this dugout, cleaning someone else's equipment and watching someone else's players throw the pitches he had taught her in his backyard. The afternoon the inciting incident happened was a Tuesday in late March, and it started the way most Tuesdays did, with the team loose and loud after a light practice, leaning against the dugout rails and talking with the easy confidence of people who had never seriously doubted their place in any room. Ethan Cole was holding court at the center of it, which was where Ethan Cole typically was. He was 17, recruited nationally, already being discussed in draft conversations that most players wouldn't enter until their senior year. He was tall with a hitter's build, wide shoulders, strong forearms, the kind of physical presence that made scouts lean forward in their seats. He knew it too, not in an obnoxious way, exactly, but in the way that someone who has been told they're exceptional since childhood eventually stops having to be told. It just becomes the air they breathe. There's not a pitcher at this school that can touch me in a live situation, Ethan was saying, settling back against the rail with his arms crossed. Ask Riley. Ask Whitmore. I've gone 42 straight at-bats without a strikeout under real conditions. That's actually insane, said one of the outfielders, a tall kid named Preston Webb who worshipped Ethan the way younger brothers worship older ones. Nobody can touch you, man. Nobody here. Ethan agreed, and a few players laughed. Aaliyah was at the far end of the dugout, reorganizing the bat rack, her back mostly to the group. She wasn't listening on purpose. She couldn't help it. What about off-speed? Another player asked. Davis has been working on that curve. Davis telegraphs it every time. Ethan said. You can read it from the box. He drops his shoulder. That was actually correct, Aaliyah knew. She'd watched Davis throw. She'd noticed the shoulder drop herself. Nobody's striking Ethan out, Preston declared, settling the question with the finality of someone who had never considered being wrong. Aaliyah kept her hands on the bat rack. She was arranging them by length, smallest to largest. Her fingers touched the grip of a 32-inch model, and she stilled for just a moment. She didn't plan what she said next. It came out the way truths sometimes do, not from deliberation, but from the place where knowing becomes too heavy to hold quietly. I could strike him out in 3 pitches. She said it at a normal volume, not loudly, not performing it, just said it, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. And for a half-second, there was a silence that she recognized immediately as the silence before something breaks. Then the dugout exploded. The laughter wasn't quick and over. It built, rolling from one end of the bench to the other, players nudging each other, phones coming out before anyone had consciously decided to record anything. Ethan uncrossed his arms and looked at her for the first time with the expression of someone who has been told a mildly entertaining joke. 3 pitches, he repeated, and let the absurdity of it hang in the air. 3 pitches, Aaliyah said again, still calm. Coach Darren Whitmore appeared from the mouth of the tunnel then, drawn by the noise. He was a big man, heavy-set, with a face that had spent 40 years expressing certainty. He'd played minor league ball in his 20s, made it close but not quite, and had spent the decade since coaching the next generation with the particular intensity of someone channeling an old ambition. He was not a gentleman. He had a narrow sense of who belonged in baseball and a wide vocabulary for communicating who didn't. "What's going on?" he asked. "The clubhouse girl says she can strike me out in 3 pitches, Ethan said, with the casual amusement of someone reporting a funny headline. Whitmore looked at Aaliyah. His gaze was not curious or even particularly hostile. It was dismissive in the specific way that dismissal becomes its own form of cruelty, the kind that doesn't bother to be angry because it doesn't bother to take you seriously enough. "You," he said. "Yes, sir," Aaliyah replied. "You're here to organize the equipment." "I know, and I can still strike him out in 3 pitches. The laughter around them had shifted slightly, still there, but sharpened now, waiting to see how this would go. Whitmore's expression tightened. "You don't belong on this field," he said, simply and plainly, the way you'd state a rule of physics. "Not as a player. Not as anything except what you were hired to be. You understand me?" Aaliyah held his gaze. "Give me one chance." Someone across the dugout made a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. Phones were still recording. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that something shifted in the air, some micro weight of the moment making itself known, and then he did something that surprised her. He shrugged. "Fine," he said, with the tone of a man demonstrating something. "Tomorrow, practice field, 1 at-bat. You get your 3 pitches." He said it like a dismissal, like the fastest way to end a conversation that had gone on longer than it deserved. Around them, players were already texting, already sharing the clip, already turning the moment into entertainment. Aaliyah turned back to the bat rack. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. Behind her, she didn't see what she couldn't have known. At the edge of the dugout, leaning against the tunnel wall with his arms folded and his eyes narrowed slightly, Coach Ray Riley had watched the whole exchange without laughing once. He'd been Whitmore's assistant for 4 seasons. He'd seen plenty of talented kids pass through. He'd seen fewer of them have that particular stillness when they were being mocked, that specific kind of quiet that doesn't come from timidity, but from something much harder to name. He watched Aaliyah go back to organizing the bats, unhurried, undisturbed, and something in the back of his mind that he hadn't used in a while started working. That evening, after the team had gone and the facility was quieting down into its end-of-day routines, Aaliyah pulled out her father's old notebook from the bottom of her bag. It was falling apart at the spine. Decades of use had done that, and the pages were covered in his handwriting, tight and careful, pitch diagrams and notes about grip and release and the geometry of making a ball do something a hitter didn't expect. She read the same pages she'd read 100 times before. The same ones he'd walked her through, voice patient and specific, long before she was old enough to understand all of it. 3 pitches, she thought. That's all I need. Morning practice the next day started the same as always. Cleats on turf, the rhythmic crack of batting practice, the coach's whistles cutting across the ambient noise of the field. But by the time 10 o'clock arrived and the team gathered near the main diamond, there was an energy underneath the ordinary that everyone could feel. They'd all seen the clip by now. Some of them had shared it themselves. Ethan Cole was already at the plate by the time Aaliyah crossed the outfield grass. He was loose, easy, running through his stance with the casual fluency of someone who'd stood at the plate 10,000 times. He hadn't changed his demeanor. He was still relaxed, still slightly amused, but there was a precision to his warm-up swings that hadn't been there yesterday. He wasn't treating this like nothing. He was treating it like entertainment that required some small amount of attention. About 30 players and staff had gathered. Some were leaning on the dugout rail. Others stood along the first base line, phones already out, picking up where the previous day's recording had left off. There was low laughter, easy chatter, the comfortable energy of people who expect to watch something fail quickly and memorably. Nobody gave Aaliyah a uniform. She was in her street clothes, dark jeans, and a gray hoodie, and the gear she'd pulled together was borrowed without announcement. A glove from the equipment room that was a size too large, cleats that had been left in lost and found, a ball she'd lifted from the practice bucket. The borrowed glove sat awkward on her left hand when she pulled it on at the edge of the mound. She adjusted it twice, then stopped adjusting. She stepped onto the mound. The laughter around the field didn't stop all at once. It tapered, the way sound does when something unexpected insists on your attention. It wasn't her stride, though she walked with more certainty than anyone expected. It was something harder to define, the way she positioned herself at the rubber. The way her eyes went to the catcher's setup. One of the second-string catchers had crouched behind the plate, grinning, not expecting to earn his pay today. The way her gaze then moved to Ethan, measured and specific, like she was reading something written on him. Ethan tapped the plate twice with his bat and nodded at her. "Go ahead." She gripped the ball inside her glove. Four-seam grip, index and middle fingers across the narrow seams, pressure distributed exactly the way her father had shown her. She didn't rush the grip. She took the time she needed. Preston Webb, standing near the first base line, called out, "Don't hurt yourself." A few people laughed. Aaliyah didn't react. She went into her wind-up. It wasn't the prettiest mechanics anyone had ever seen. It was self-taught, refined through years of private practice in a backyard and an empty field behind her old apartment complex. But it was clean. The arm path was consistent. The hip rotation was there. The stride came down at the right angle. What nobody was ready for, what nobody in that dugout had any reason to expect, was the velocity. The pitch came in at 81 miles per hour. That number doesn't mean much in a major league context. But Ethan Cole, for all his talent, had never seen it from that particular angle at that particular placement, from someone who had picked his exact weakness before the ball left her hand. She'd thrown it to the inside corner, knee height, slightly off the plate. The one spot that his swing, for all its natural power, arrived at a half-second late when he was surprised. He swung. The timing was off. Not badly, not embarrassingly, but visibly. The bat came through an instant behind the ball, and the result was that particular sound that every hitter hates. Air, nothing, the soft whoosh of a mist that the whole field hears. The laughter didn't stop immediately, but changed in character. The easy laughter of people watching something foregone became something with less certainty in it. Someone on the first base line lowered their phone a few inches, then raised it again. Coach Riley, standing at the edge of the dugout with his arms folded, leaned forward slightly. Ethan straightened up. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked focused, maybe for the first time since he'd agreed to this. He reset his stance, re-tapped the plate, and looked at Aaliyah with eyes that had gone a degree quieter than before. "Lucky placement," someone said from the dugout. "Is it?" Another voice answered lower. The second voice belonged to a backup infielder named Marcus Doyle, a quiet kid who'd been on the bench more than the field this season and who had a habit of noticing things that other people brushed past. Aaliyah turned the ball in her glove. She was looking at Ethan, not at his face, at his setup, the way his back foot was planted, the slight forward lean in his stance that told her, in a language her father had translated for her years ago, exactly what kind of pitch his body was bracing for. He was expecting heat again. He'd adjusted for it. His weight had shifted just slightly to meet a fastball. She went in her wind-up. The curveball broke late, a sharp, decisive drop that started at the upper part of the zone and fell off the edge of the plate as it arrived. It was the pitch her father had spent 2 entire summers teaching her, the one that required exact grip pressure and a wrist rotation that had to be trained until it was unconscious. She'd thrown it 10,000 times against a fence, alone, with no one watching. Ethan swung at where the ball had started. It wasn't close to where it ended up. The silence that fell over that field was different from the silence before. The silence before had been the silence of waiting. This one was the silence of something shifting, the particular quiet of people realizing that the thing they expected is not the thing that's happening. Phones were still recording, but nobody was narrating the footage anymore. Ethan stepped out of the box. He didn't look embarrassed. He was past that. He looked at Aaliyah with something that was working toward evaluation, some internal recalibration happening behind his eyes. He bounced the bat grip against his palm twice. From the dugout, Preston said, "Quieter now." "Okay, that wasn't luck." Marcus Doyle said nothing. He just watched. Coach Whitmore was standing at the edge of the dugout with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He hadn't moved since the first pitch. His expression hadn't changed in any way that most people could have named. But Coach Riley, who'd worked alongside him for 4 years, knew what the set of Whitmore's shoulders meant when he was working hard not to react. Ethan stepped back into the box. The grin was gone entirely now. In its place was something cleaner and more honest, the focused attention of a real competitor. He knew the count. He knew what was coming, or thought he did. He'd seen 2 pitches. He understood she had repertoire, and he was now actively thinking about what to do with that information. He was good at this. That was the true measure of his talent. Not just his physical ability, but the speed at which he processed and adapted. He had recalibrated his entire approach in the space of one at-bat. He was leaning slightly forward now, weight balanced, ready to go the other way on something breaking, ready to hold back on anything off the plate. He was ready. Aaliyah rolled the ball in her glove one more time. She looked at the catcher. No real signal passing between them, no established system, and made her decision privately, inside herself, the way she'd always had to make decisions on a field. She thought about the at-bat as a complete sentence, the way her father used to describe pitching. The first pitch had been the opening word. The second had complicated it. The third had to close it. And the close had to be something the hitter hadn't seen written in either of the first 2. She threw a changeup. The arm motion was identical to her fastball, precisely, with the same pace and the same release point. Nothing in her delivery to give it away. The pitch came in slower than he expected by a full 12 miles an hour, and it came in low and away, off the edge of the plate, in the place where a hitter who's been recalibrating for a breaking ball ends up out in front of, chasing air. Ethan's swing was early. He committed to it fully, a powerful, completely committed swing, and the bat moved through a zone where the ball was not and would not be. The follow-through was almost violent in how far it came around, his hips fully opened, his whole body invested in a pitch that had already arrived and passed. Strike 3. The catcher caught the ball in the middle of his chest. He looked at it for a second, like he was confirming it was real, then stood up slowly. For a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, maybe longer, nobody on that field made a sound. Then one of the pitchers near the bullpen said it, low and plain. She just did it. It wasn't a celebration. It was more like an observation, the kind you make when something happens that doesn't fit the category system you'd been using. Ethan Cole stood at the plate with his bat down at his side and looked at the mound with an expression that had no performance in it. It was pure. He was genuinely, perhaps for the first time in years, surprised. Aaliyah stepped off the rubber. She handed the borrowed glove back to the catcher, who took it without speaking. She smoothed the front of her hoodie. She didn't look at the dugout. She didn't look for reaction or recognition. She had a job to finish. The equipment room needed restocking before afternoon, and she turned and began walking back across the grass. She made it about 30 feet before Coach Whitmore's voice came from behind her. "Beginner's luck," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She got him nervous. He wasn't locked in. That's all that was. A few players near the dugout nodded, some because they believed it, more because believing it was easier than the alternative. Ethan said nothing. He walked to the other side of the diamond and stood there a moment before someone passed him a fresh bat and practice resumed. Coach Riley stayed where he was for a moment after everyone moved on. He looked at the mound, empty now, and then at the path Aaliyah had taken back toward the equipment room. He thought about the curveball's break, the changeup's arm speed, the deliberate sequence of all 3 pitches, not just thrown, but designed, built to tell a story that ended exactly one way. Somewhere, someone had already posted a new clip. It was short, roughly 58 seconds, and it started with the borrowed glove being adjusted on the mound and ended with that final swing in empty air. By the time the morning's practice ended and players were heading to the locker room, the clip had been picked up by 2 regional sports accounts, one college recruiting newsletter, and a high-volume baseball content page with 2 million followers. The caption on that last one was plain. Unknown girl strikes out top draft prospect in 3 pitches. By evening, It had been viewed 400,000 times. By the following morning, it had crossed 1 million. Sports commentators who hadn't talked to each other in months were being booked on the same panels. Draft analysts were looking up Harrington Academy's roster and finding exactly 0 female pitchers listed on it. Someone found the original clip from the dugout, the one where Whitmore said she didn't belong on the field, and clipped it together with the strikeout footage into a 2-minute video that spread faster than either clip had on its own. Nobody asked Aaliyah for a comment. She was back in the equipment room when most of this was happening, cataloging practice bats, unaware that the thing she'd done that morning had just become, in the language of people far outside that field, a story. But stories, once they start moving, don't wait for anyone's awareness. Something had been set in motion. Something that Coach Whitmore hadn't counted on and couldn't call beginner's luck, because beginner's luck didn't design a 3-pitch sequence with that kind of intentionality. Something that the scouts and sponsors and league officials watching the footage from their offices would recognize in the way people who've spent their careers around rare talent always recognize it. Not with fanfare, but with a very specific stillness. And in the worn pages of her father's notebook, in the diagram of the change-up grip he'd drawn when she was 10 years old, Aaliyah Brooks had something that none of the people watching those clips could see. The beginning of a reason. The morning after the clip crossed 1 million views, Harrington Academy's athletic director received 11 emails before 8 o'clock. 3 were from journalists. 2 were from college recruiting services wanting a comment. 1 was from a national sports network asking about availability for a phone interview. 4 were from a marketing firm representing Caldwell Sports Group, the corporate entity whose 50-page sponsorship proposal was currently sitting on Coach Whitmore's desk, tied to the most lucrative exhibition deal in Harrington's 41-year history. That last set of 4 was the one that changed the temperature of everything. The $100 million game had been in development for nearly 8 months. Caldwell Sports Group had approached the school in the fall with a proposal that had made the athletic director sit very still for a long time before responding. The concept was straightforward in the way that enormous sums of money always make things seem. A nationally televised exhibition game between Harrington's program and a curated lineup of elite prospects from across the country. A kind of all-star showcase for the next generation of the sport. The broadcast rights alone were worth $30 million. The sponsorship packages, the merchandise, the streaming deals layered on top made the total figure sit comfortably at $100 million in projected revenue over a 5-year rollout. The game was already scheduled. The date was already announced. Tickets had already sold. And now, one of Caldwell's senior brand managers was on the phone with the athletic director saying, with careful professional warmth, that they'd seen the video. "She's a story," the brand manager said. "And stories are what make people watch." By noon, word had reached Coach Whitmore through channels he could not easily dismiss. The conversation was not a request. It was a pressure wrapped in polite language, the kind of pressure that institutional money applies when it has decided what it wants and is simply waiting for the humans involved to arrange themselves accordingly. Whitmore sat with that pressure for the rest of the afternoon and did not like a single second of it. Inside the team, the climate had fractured cleanly in 2. There were players who'd watched the strikeout footage 6, 7, 8 times and arrived at the same conclusion each time, that what they'd seen on that practice field was not luck, not a fluke, not beginner's nerves on Ethan's part. That was real, specific, and earned. Some of them said this quietly to each other in the locker room. A few of them said nothing, but something in how they watched Aaliyah move through the clubhouse had changed. She was no longer entirely invisible to them. Then there were the others. Ethan Cole moved through the next several days with a focused energy that the coaching staff initially interpreted as healthy competitive drive, until it became clear that what was actually driving him was something older and less clean. His reputation had been the one constant in his life since he was 12 years old, the thing that preceded him into every room, the thing that agents and scouts and coaches spoke about in a specific reverent shorthand. And that reputation had been in 58 seconds of phone footage, complicated in a way he did not know how to process. He didn't say anything directly to Aaliyah during those days, but the energy around him when she was nearby had a particular texture, tight, watchful, looking for the opening to restore the order of things. The players in his orbit felt it and reflected it back at him, the way groups of people always absorb and amplify the mood of the person at their center. Small things started happening that Aaliyah noticed, but couldn't immediately explain. Her assigned equipment locker had been cleared out, gear moved to a different room without notice. A practice slot that Coach Riley had quietly added to the schedule under a generic name disappeared from the board 2 days in a row. A bucket of practice balls she'd set aside went missing before she could use it. Each individual thing had an innocent explanation. Together, they had a pattern. She didn't say anything about it. She adapted, found workarounds, kept moving. It was Coach Riley who finally said something directly to her. Not on the field, but in the corridor outside the equipment room on a Thursday evening when the building had mostly emptied out. He stopped beside her without preamble, the way he did most things. "How long have you been throwing?" he asked. Aaliyah looked at him. "Since I was 9. Riley was quiet for a moment. He was a lean man in his mid-40s, with the unhurried quality of someone who'd learned patience the hard way. He played college ball, gone as far as the low minors, understood exactly where the ceiling was and made peace with it earlier than most. He'd been coaching since he was 26. He knew what talent looked like in its unfinished state, the specific ways certain mechanics were self-taught, the specific intelligence behind pitch sequencing that nobody had trained formally but that existed anyway, fully formed because some people simply heard the game differently. He'd seen it in Aaliyah's 3 pitches. The fastball placement wasn't guesswork. The curveball break was too consistent. The changeup arm speed was too clean for someone who'd never been coached. "Who taught you the change?" he asked. She held his gaze for a second. "My dad." Riley nodded once. Like that answered more than the question. "There's a side field behind the maintenance building," he said. "I'm out there at 6:30 tomorrow morning. Equipment's unlocked." He walked away without waiting for a response. Aaliyah stood in the corridor for a moment after he was gone. Then she went back to restocking the equipment shelves, and her hands were steady. The sessions that followed happened before sunrise, in the flat gray light of early mornings when the main facilities were still quiet. Riley didn't talk much during them. He watched, corrected occasionally, asked her to repeat specific sequences so he could study the mechanics from different angles. He had a catcher's mitt he'd brought from his car, his own, not school equipment, and he caught her throws himself. What he was learning, across those mornings, confirmed the initial read he'd made from the dugout. She had the fastball velocity, inconsistent at the moment, but with real ceiling. The curveball was her best pitch already. It had the kind of late break that pitching coaches spent years trying to develop artificially in other arms. The changeup was sophisticated in a way that surprised him most. The feel for it, the ability to replicate the arm speed, was not something you built from instruction alone. That came from hours of private practice, thousands of repetitions in empty spaces, a level of committed solitary work that he'd seen from perhaps 5 players in his entire coaching life. He also began to understand, in those mornings, what her father had given her. Not just mechanics, not just drills, a way of reading the game that went all the way down, a kind of intuitive understanding of what pitching actually was beneath the physics of it. Darnell Brooks had been, by all accounts that Riley had quietly pieced together over the years, a genuinely exceptional pitcher. The kind of sport loses occasionally, for reasons that rarely have anything to do with ability. He didn't share that with her yet. It wasn't the right time, and he wasn't sure he had the full picture. What he focused on instead was the practical, building her repertoire, improving velocity consistency, working on the mental approach to high-leverage moments. She was a fast learner in the way that people are fast learners when they're not actually starting from the beginning. Marcus Doyle had started showing up at those early morning sessions by the second week. Nobody had invited him exactly. He'd seen Riley's car in the lot before sunrise one morning and followed his instinct. He was a quiet, perceptive kid who'd been riding the bench all season with a maturity about it that suggested he understood the program's politics better than most. He wasn't particularly gifted with the bat, but he was meticulous and observant, and he decided, without stating it publicly, that what was happening on that side field mattered. He started bringing water, setting up the catcher's equipment so Riley didn't have to, keeping track of pitch counts. Small things, The kind of support that doesn't make headlines, but makes everything run smoother. Aaliyah appreciated it in the quiet way she appreciated most things, without much fanfare, but completely. By the time most of Harrington's students arrived at school that Thursday morning, the story had been picked up by 4 national sports networks, 2 major newspapers, and a constellation of social media accounts with audiences large enough to move the conversation at scale. The original strikeout clip had been recirculating for a week already, and now it had a context that made it mean something different, not just a remarkable moment, but the opening chapter of something. Commentators who'd been treating it as novelty were now treating it as news. The responses split immediately and loudly along predictable lines. There were people who watched the footage and saw what it was, a 17-year-old with genuine ability, doing something genuinely remarkable, being given a platform that the footage itself had created. They were enthusiastic, loud, and generated significant broadcast engagement numbers that Caldwell's analysts tracked in real time with visible satisfaction. There were others who saw it differently. Former players with media platforms were expressing concern about integrity. A columnist for a prominent baseball publication wrote a piece arguing that inserting a non-traditionally trained pitcher into a high-stakes exhibition for promotional value was a disservice to the sport's standards. He used the phrase publicity stunt 3 times in 7 paragraphs. His piece was shared widely by people who agreed with him and widely by people who disagreed, and the net effect was more attention on Aaliyah than any straightforward positive story would have generated. The criticism didn't land differently on Aaliyah than the previous mockery had, which is to say, it landed but it didn't move her. She read some of it. She closed the tab and went back to her father's pitch diagrams. Inside Harrington, the announcement hit the locker room like a weather event. The players who'd been quietly impressed by what they'd seen on the practice field received the news with something approaching relief, like a thing they'd already believed had been confirmed in an official language they could now speak openly. Marcus Doyle told 2 players he trusted. They told others. A quiet pocket of genuine support formed, not loudly, but solidly. The louder response came from the other direction. Ethan Cole found Aaliyah in the equipment room on Thursday afternoon. He came alone, which was unusual. He typically moved with a gravitational field of teammates. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, as if choosing which version of what he wanted to say to lead with. "You got lucky with a sponsor," he said finally. "That's what this is." Aaliyah looked at him. She was holding a clipboard with an equipment inventory list, and she didn't put it down. "They want a storyline," Ethan continued. "Your storyline. That's different from being a pitcher. Is that what you need to think?" she asked. He didn't answer that immediately. "I'm not trying to be mean," he said, and she believed that was partially true. "I'm trying to tell you what's going to happen. When you go out there in a real game, against real hitters with real pressure, it's not the same as one at-bat on a practice field." "I know what real pressure is," she said quietly. Something in the way she said it, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact with depth behind it, caught him slightly off guard. He held her gaze for a second longer than he intended, then looked away. "I was wrong about you," was not something Ethan Cole was able to say yet, but the door was fractionally open. She could see that much. He left. She made a note on the inventory clipboard and kept working. Coach Whitmore's final attempt to limit her came through the roster structure. The addition of Aaliyah to the official lineup had been non-negotiable. The sponsor had made that clear through channels above Whitmore's pay grade. But the game's internal strategy was still his domain, and he intended to use it. He scheduled her for the back end of the bullpen. If the game went as planned, if Harrington's existing starters controlled the early innings the way they were capable of, she would warm up in the bullpen and not throw a single pitch in live action. She'd be on the roster, on the field, in the camera's peripheral vision, satisfying the letter of the sponsor's request without ever actually affecting the game. He didn't explain this to anyone. He didn't need to. He was the coach. Coach Riley saw the roster plan and said nothing in the room where Whitmore presented it. He sat with it overnight. He thought about what he knew about Aaliyah's mechanics, her pitch repertoire, the velocity numbers he'd been tracking across 3 weeks of early morning sessions. He thought about what he'd pieced together about her father. He thought about the game, not as a career moment, but as a game the way he'd always been built to think about it. Then he went and found Whitmore before practice on Friday and told him, plainly, that if the starters struggled and Aaliyah wasn't deployed, the resulting footage of a bench pitcher while the team fell apart would produce a media narrative that made the sponsor uncomfortable in ways that the game's logistics would not be able to contain. Whitmore told him that was his concern to manage. Riley said, "Yes, sir," and left it there. Game day arrived with the weight of things that had been anticipated too long. The stadium, a regional facility that Harrington had arranged for the exhibition, large enough to hold 12,000, was full before the opening pitch. National broadcast trucks were lined along the access road behind the outfield fence. Caldwell's hospitality suite on the press level had been booked for 3 weeks. Camera placements had been mapped by a production team that handled major college sporting events and knew exactly where the interesting footage came from. Aaliyah arrived at the facility 2 hours before first pitch. She went through her preparation alone, stretching in a corner of the bullpen, working through her arm routine with the same focused quiet she brought to everything. Around her, the larger machinery of the event moved and hummed. Players gave media interviews on the warning track. Coaches adjusted lineups. Groundskeepers dragged the infield one final time. She didn't talk to anyone she didn't need to. In the bullpen, warming up an hour before game time, she threw at 60% and focused on the feel of each pitch, the seam pressure, the release point, the way the ball moved through the cool morning air. Everything felt clean, not effortless. She wasn't someone who confused the feeling of readiness with the absence of effort, but controlled, organized. Marcus Doyle appeared beside the bullpen fence about 40 minutes before first pitch and passed a bottle of water through the chain link without ceremony. "Everything good?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. He nodded and went back toward the dugout. The game's first 3 innings went the way Whitmore had planned them. Harrington's starting pitcher, a senior named Carson Brooks, no relation, held the opposition scoreless through the second, working with the efficient economy of a player who knew exactly where his talent ceiling was and had learned to perform just below it. The lineup produced a run in the bottom of the second on a combination of a walk, a stolen base, and a single. It felt, for approximately 90 minutes, like a controlled situation. The 4th inning changed that. The opposition's lineup, assembled by Caldwell's talent team from programs across the country, had spent 3 innings cataloging what Carson was throwing and when. In the 4th, they broke the code cleanly. A leadoff double, a walk, and a 2-run single put them ahead before Whitmore pulled Carson and went to his second arm. The second arm walked the first batter he faced and gave up a long ball to the second. 4-1. The stadium's energy shifted perceptibly, not panic, but the particular attention that crowds give to games that have stopped being comfortable. Whitmore stood in the dugout with his arms folded and stared at the field with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd already decided. His second-best reliever was warming up in the bullpen. He was also looking further down the bullpen at Aaliyah Brooks. The broadcast cameras were not, technically, watching the bullpen at that exact moment. But the production team had enough feeds running that the footage existed. Whitmore's long look down the bullpen line, the slight shift of his jaw, the private internal war of a man choosing between his pride and his understanding of what was necessary. He made the call to the bullpen. "Brooks," the bullpen coach said. Aaliyah was already on her feet. Walking in from the bullpen was not the same as crossing a practice field in borrowed cleats. The distance was roughly the same. Every other variable was different. The stadium noise was a physical thing. 12,000 people, commentary through the speakers, the layered sound of an event that had been 6 months in the building and was now landing in real time on top of her. The cameras found her immediately. She could see herself on the outfield scoreboard screen in her peripheral vision as she walked, which was an experience she had no reference point for and chose, deliberately, not to think about. The crowd was not unified. She could hear it. There was genuine, loud support, concentrated in certain sections where people had clearly come specifically for this, and there was a lower, resistant undertone from people who had not changed their minds from what they'd read and thought and posted about. Both sounds are real. She acknowledged both and let them sit behind her, as she reached the mound. She took the ball from the umpire. She turned it in her hand. The same motion she always made, the same grip check, the same brief, private confirmation of what she was about to do. From the dugout, someone said, 3 pitches. Let's see if you can do it again. She wasn't sure who said it. She didn't turn around to find out. She looked at the hitter, a powerfully built 18-year-old named Deshaun Merritt from a program in Georgia, nationally ranked, already being discussed in the same early draft conversations Ethan occupied. He was watching her from the batter's box with the calm, measuring attention of someone who had done his homework. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't dismissive. He was simply there, ready, organized. This was not Ethan in a practice showdown. This was something different. She knew that. She had known it before she walked in from the bullpen. It didn't change what she had to do. She went into her wind-up. The stadium, for just a moment, got quiet in the particular way it does when something that has been anticipated for a long time is finally, actually happening. And Aaliyah Brooks threw the first pitch. The first pitch was a fastball, and Deshaun Merritt didn't miss it by much. That was the thing about facing someone at this level. The margin between a clean swing and a foul tip was measured in fractions of the naked I couldn't reliably track. Deshaun got the barrel on it, just barely, and the ball skipped foul down the third base line with a sharp crack that sent a murmur through the crowd. Not a miss, not a hit, something in between, which was its own kind of message. He stepped out of the box. He took one breath, controlled, deliberate, and stepped back in. From the dugout, the broadcast field microphone picked up something that would be replayed in the highlights later. Deshaun saying, quietly and without hostility, "You're the girl from the video, right?" Aaliyah didn't answer. She was already reading him. The way his weight sat on his back foot, the slight opening in his front shoulder, the quality of attention in his eyes. He wasn't underestimating her. She'd registered that immediately. He'd come to this at-bat with information. He'd watched the clip, broken down what she'd thrown, and arrived at the plate with a working theory about what she was going to do. That was both more and less dangerous than someone who came in blind. More dangerous because he was prepared. Less dangerous because a theory was still a theory, and theories could be broken. The crowd was loud in a sustained, pressured way. Not the sharp bursts of crowd noise that came with action, but the continuous undertone of 12,000 people paying very close attention. The broadcast cameras had closed in. On the scoreboard screen, Aaliyah could see the pitch count graphic had already populated with her name. She turned the ball at her glove, and for just a moment, one breath's worth of a moment, felt something she hadn't felt on the practice field. It came as an image. Her father on a mound she'd only seen in photographs. A minor league park somewhere in the South, the stand behind him half empty. His face in that particular expression she recognized from the ones he made when things were hard and he was choosing not to show it. She knew the story around that photograph without being told it directly. The year it was taken was the year things had started to fall apart for him. He'd pitched brilliantly that season. None of it had mattered in the way it should have. The image came and went in the space of a single breath. She let it. Then she looked at the catcher's setup, low and away, and shook her head once, almost imperceptibly. The catcher adjusted. She shook her head again. He reset. She wanted the pitch she wanted, not the one that fit the standard sequence. That was what her father had written about in the notebook's back pages. The courage of making the pitch that was actually correct rather than the one that felt safe. The one that your read of the hitter told you to throw, not the one that the situation told you to default to. From the dugout, Coach Riley watched her shake off the catcher twice. He touched his chest, 2 fingers, the signal they developed across 3 weeks of early morning sessions. Trust your read, not the plan. Your read. She went into her wind-up. The pitch was a change-up, same arm speed as the fastball she'd thrown first, the same delivery, nothing in the mechanics to advertise what was coming. It came in 8 miles per hour slower than the fastball and broke slightly down and in. Deshaun's swing was early in underneath it. Not by much, but clearly. The ball caught the bottom of the zone, and the umpire's hand came out. Strike 2. The crowd's noise shifted in a way that was physically distinct from what it had been. It rose, compressed, and then sat at a new level. Higher, more engaged, the sound of people who have stopped watching passively and started watching with their whole attention. Deshaun stepped out again. This time he stood there a second longer than before. He looked at Aaliyah with something that had moved past assessment into something closer to genuine engagement. The specific attention that competitors give each other when the contest has become real. "You're not just guessing," he said. It wasn't a question. She still didn't answer. But something in the quality of her stillness, the way she stood at the rubber with the ball held at her side, unhurried, waiting, communicated something back to him that words would have been inadequate for. The dugout behind her had gone quiet in a way that was different from the silence of people watching something fail. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Ethan Cole was sitting at the far end of the bench. He had his forearms on his knees, and he was leaning forward, watching the mound with an expression that nobody near him would have been able to fully categorize. He'd been in this game. He knew what it felt like to stand in that box against someone with command. He knew the difference between someone who was lucky and someone who was reading you. And what he was watching from his end of the bench was unmistakably the latter. He didn't say anything. He watched. Aaliyah went in her third pitch. She threw a two-seam fastball, running it in on Deshaun's hands, a pitch designed not to miss the barrel cleanly, but to force contact off the wrong part of it. It was not the dramatic, unhittable pitch that the practice field strikeout had been. It was something more sophisticated, a pitch that gave him something to hit and gave him exactly the contact she wanted him to make. He swung. The ball came off the bat. Not weakly, but not cleanly either. It rolled hard to the left side of the infield, a sharp grounder that the shortstop fielded cleanly and fired to first. Out. No strikeout. No dramatic swing and miss. Just a controlled, efficient, deliberately induced ground ball that resulted in an out, which was the point, which had always been the point, which the people in the stands who understood the game recognized immediately and responded to with the particular appreciation that baseball fans reserve for intelligence over flash. The commentator's booth, which had been speaking in the careful, hedged language of people who didn't want to overcommit, shifted tone. "She is not a gimmick," one of them said, plain and direct, into the broadcast microphone. "What we just watched was a professional pitch sequence from a 17-year-old making her first live appearance. That is extraordinary." The crowd built on itself. Not just the sections that had come in already convinced, sections that had been skeptical, waiting, holding something back. Those sections let go of what they'd been holding. In the dugout, Whitmore stood with his arms folded and watched the crowd and the field and the scoreboard all at once. The score was still 4-1. The game was still in a difficult place. But the temperature of the moment had changed in a way he felt without wanting to acknowledge it, like weather shifting before you can see the clouds. He had built his coaching career on the idea that he understood the game better than anyone around him. That certainty had never been seriously challenged, because the system he operated within had been designed, at every level, to confirm it. He was standing in the middle of that certainty's first real crack. The inning ended. Harrington came up to bat. The broadcast cut to commercial, and the stadium's ambient music swelled, and in the Caldwell Sports Group Hospitality Suite upstairs, a senior brand manager was already on a call describing, in the measured professional vocabulary of someone trying not to sound too pleased, what the numbers were doing. The viewership had spiked in the 2 minutes Aaliyah had been on the mound. They were still climbing. Between innings, Aaliyah sat at the end of the dugout bench with a cup of water and her father's worn-down mechanics notes folded into the back pocket of her uniform pants. Not to read, just to have. Marcus Doyle sat 2 spots away from her. He didn't talk. Neither did she. That was the understanding they'd built without negotiating it. Coach Riley came and crouched beside the bench briefly. "Next time I put you back out there," he said quietly, "trust the 2-seam when you need a quick out. You've got late run on it today." She nodded. He stood and went back to the coach's area without drawing attention to the conversation. From across the dugout, Ethan was watching. He looked away when she glanced in his direction, which told her more than if he'd held her gaze. The game moved through its middle innings with the unpredictable momentum that close games develop. Harrington pushing back, getting a run in the 5th to make it 4-2, then giving one back in the 6th when the reliever who'd come in behind Aaliyah's appearance surrendered a solo shot to left field. The score sat at 5-2, and the crowd's energy had settled into a focused, buzzing tension. Aaliyah warmed up again in the bullpen in the seventh and was brought back in to start the eighth. The announcers said her name again, and the crowd responded again as she walked back in from the bullpen and felt, this time, that the field recognized her in some small way, or she recognized the field, which amounted to the same thing. She got through the eighth on 11 pitches, 2 groundouts and a strikeout. The strikeout coming on a curveball with a break that the hitter started moving toward and then couldn't stop moving toward, like watching a car go off a road in slow motion. The crowd responded to that one with a full, unambiguous roar that bounced off the stadium structure and came back at the field from every direction. And then the broadcast announced, during the commercial break before the ninth, that this game, this specific exhibition, was the determining event for the finalization of a $100 million league expansion contract currently under negotiation between Caldwell Sports Group and regional baseball authorities. That the outcome and the viewership numbers from this single afternoon were the metrics that would trigger the expansion deal signing. The announcers said it in their broadcast voices. The stadium heard it through the public address system. The story, which had already been big, became something else entirely. Aaliyah wasn't playing a game anymore. She was determining the future shape of a league. She sat in the dugout and listened to the announcement with her hands quiet in her lap, and thought about her father's notebook and about how the game behind every game was always larger than the game itself, and about how knowing that had never made the pitching different. You still threw one pitch at a time. You still read the hitter in front of you. You still made the decision your read told you to make. Everything else was noise. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them. 9 innings. Let's finish it. The story that broke during the game's 7th inning stretch did not come from inside Harrington. It came from a sports journalist named Patricia Gaines, who worked for a regional publication that covered the intersection of baseball and institutional history, and who had spent the better part of a week following a thread that the viral clip had first unspooled for her. The thread started with Aaliyah's last name and ran backward through time, through old box scores and league records, and a name that appeared in the mid-90s and then, abruptly, stopped appearing. Aaliyah Brooks. Gaines published the piece during the game's 7th inning stretch, a calculated timing that guaranteed maximum readership. The headline was measured. The reporting beneath it was not. It laid out, with documentation, the story of a pitcher who had been genuinely exceptional by every measurable standard: velocity, movement, strike percentage, performance under pressure, and whose career had ended not through injury or decline, but through a process that Gaines described as a systematic closing of doors by people with the institutional authority to close them. The piece named the league officials involved. It named the agents who had declined to represent him. And near the end, in a paragraph that was careful and legally precise, it named the programs and coaches whose decisions had been part of the pattern. One of the names was Coach Darren Whitmore. Coach Riley found Aaliyah during the top of the 8th, before her second appearance. He came to the bullpen, which was unusual enough that Marcus Doyle looked up from his phone and then, reading something in Riley's posture, quietly found somewhere else to be. Riley sat on the bullpen bench beside her. He held a printout of the article. Someone had sent it to his phone, and he'd printed it in the press room. He held it for a moment without giving it to her. "There's something you're going to find out today," he said. "I'd rather you heard it from me than from a notification on your phone." She looked at the printout in his hand. Something in her chest tightened, a physical presentiment of the thing that was coming, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind does. "Tell me," she said. He gave her the article. She read it the way she did most things, carefully, without rushing, all the way through to the end. Riley sat beside her and let her read. Around them, the stadium's noise continued its cycle of tension and release. Neither of them tracked it. When she finished, she folded the article along its existing creases and held it in both hands. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything for a long moment. What she felt was not shock. She'd known, in the way of children who grow up watching a parent carry something heavy, that there was more to her father's story than had been explained to her. She'd known there was a door that had been closed to him rather than one he'd chosen to leave. She'd put pieces of it together over the years from things her mother hadn't quite said, and photographs her father had put away, and a silence around certain subjects that was too deliberate to be accidental. But knowing the shape of something and having it confirmed in documented, printed sentences were different experiences. Whitmore, the same man who'd looked her in the face 2 weeks ago and told her she didn't belong on the field. The same man who'd moved her equipment locker and blocked her practice slots and called her a fluke in front of the people she was trying to earn respect from. He hadn't just dismissed her. He'd been part of the system that had erased her father. "How long have you known?" she asked. Her voice was level. "Pieces of it," Riley said. "Long enough that I should have said something sooner." He paused. "I didn't have the full picture until this week. I should have looked harder." She nodded once, slowly, and stood up. "I have an inning to pitch," she said. Riley looked at her. "Aaliyah, I know what I'm doing," she said. Quiet, composed, certain. "I'll deal with the rest when the game is done." He studied her for a moment, looking for the fracture that a revelation like that should have created, and found something else instead. Something that was controlled anger and inherited purpose and the specific gravity of a person who has just been handed the final piece of a story they've been living their whole life, without the ending. He nodded. "Go pitch." She went and pitched. The 8th inning was 11 pitches, efficient and clean, and she did not think about her father or Whitmore or the article folded in her back pocket. She thought about the hitters in front of her and the ball in her hand and the mechanical details of what her body needed to do. That was the discipline her father had taught her, not the absence of feeling, but the ability to put feeling where it belonged and work in the space that remained. She came off the field after the 3rd out and went directly to the corridor beside the dugout, which was quiet at that point in the game. She stood there for 60 seconds. Let herself feel it, the full weight of what she'd read, the anger that was clean and real and earned, the grief underneath it that was older than this afternoon. Then she went back into the dugout. Ethan was near the water cooler at the corridor entrance when she came through. He'd clearly been in the process of moving away and then stopped. He had the look of someone who had been standing there longer than he'd intended. "I heard," he said simply. She looked at him. "About your dad," he said. He seemed uncertain in a way she'd never seen him be. Not the manufactured uncertainty of someone managing an impression, but the genuine kind, the kind that comes when the story you've been telling yourself stops fitting the facts. She waited. "I've been in this program 4 years," he said. "I knew things were. I knew the way things worked here. I told myself it was just how baseball was." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know about your father specifically. I didn't ask about what I didn't know," which is its own thing. It was not a full apology. It was the beginning of an honest accounting, which was rarer and more valuable. She recognized the difference. "I'm not here to prove Whitmore wrong," she said. "I know what people think that is. It's not what it is." "What is it?" he asked. She thought about the notebook, about the mound diagram on the back page that her father had drawn in blue pen with the release points circled, about the sentence at the bottom of that page that she had read so many times the paper was soft along the fold. "I'm here to finish what he started," she said. The words didn't come out as a declaration. They came out the way real things come out when you say them for the first time aloud, simply, without performance, with the weight of their truth already in them before the speaking. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a single nod, small and genuine, the kind that means something because it costs something. He stepped aside and let her pass. Coach Whitmore was in his office between innings when the athletic director came in and closed the door. The conversation that followed was brief and left Whitmore standing at his desk with an expression that hadn't fully settled into any recognizable shape. The article had been seen by Caldwell's legal team. Caldwell's legal team had called the athletic director. The athletic director had called the league liaison. A chain of reactions had moved through the institutional structure in the 22 minutes since publication with the efficiency of things that people have been quietly waiting to have a reason to act on. Nothing was being decided tonight. Investigations took time. But the weight of the conversation was clear enough that Whitmore understood, standing at his desk after the athletic director left, that the ground he'd been standing on for a very long time had shifted beneath him in a way it would not shift back. He came back to the dugout for the 9th inning and stood at his spot at the end of the bench. He looked out at the field, then at the bullpen, then at Aaliyah sitting at the other end of the dugout with her hands quiet in her lap. He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look back at him. He thought about what he might say, if he were someone who said the things he should say. He thought about the decision he'd been part of decades ago, the one that had felt at the time like simple pragmatism, like managing a situation that needed managing, like doing what needed to be done to keep a certain kind of order in a place where order was what he understood. He had not spent very much time thinking about that decision in the years since, because the years since had not required him to. He thought about it now. He thought about Darnell Brooks, the way the man could pitch, the specific quality of his ability that Whitmore had recognized even then, because recognizing talent was the thing Whitmore was genuinely good at and had always been genuinely good at. He had recognized it and still been part of what happened. That was the thing he had never made himself say clearly, even inside his own head. He had recognized it and still been part of what happened. He stood at the end of the bench and watched the field and felt the weight of that sentence settle on him with a finality that no justification he'd ever constructed could lift. In the locker room, the team had been splitting all season. Tonight, it cleaved completely. The players who had been quietly on Aaliyah's side, Marcus Doyle, two outfielders, a reliever named Grant Patterson who had been watching her mechanics for weeks with barely concealed admiration, made their position visible in small ways. They sat near her in the dugout. They acknowledged her between innings with the specific body language of people claiming an alliance. The players at Ethan's end of the bench had expected him to hold the line. He hadn't. He hadn't crossed to Aaliyah's side in any public, dramatic way. That wasn't who he was, and nobody who knew him would have believed it. But he had stopped reinforcing the position he'd held. He had gone quiet, and his silence, given his centrality in the locker room's social gravity, was louder than many people's statements. Preston Webb kept looking at Ethan as if waiting for cues that were no longer coming. The locker room division wasn't resolved tonight, but its shape had changed, and the change had started with a single conversation in a dugout corridor that nobody had witnessed directly, but that everyone, in a way that groups of people always sense shifts in their central figures, had somehow already felt. The ninth inning began with a score at 5-2. 3 outs needed. Harrington had pulled within 2 in the top half with a 2-run double, then left the tying run on base. The game was not over, but the math was steep. What the game was, in every sense that mattered beyond the scoreboard, was Aaliyah's. She walked to the mound for the ninth with the article folded in her back pocket and her father's mechanics. Seam pressure, arm path, release point, organized in her body as completely as language. The crowd received her now with something that had consolidated past the divided noise of the early innings into something more unified. It wasn't unanimous. It never would be. But it was real, and it was loud, and it was directed at the mound. She stood on the rubber and looked in at the catcher. From the dugout, Coach Riley watched her with his arms folded and his face showing nothing. Ethan Cole leaned forward on the bench with his forearms on his knees. Marcus Doyle stood at the dugout rail. The first batter of the ninth stepped in, and Aaliyah turned the ball over in her glove and found the seam and felt the exact weight of everything her father had given her. Every pitch, every lesson, every morning in the backyard, and every notebook page settle in her arm like it had always lived there. Then she pitched. The ninth inning began the way all final innings do, with the weight of everything that came before it sitting on top of every pitch. Aaliyah stood on the rubber and took one breath. The stadium's noise was continuous now, a sustained wall of sound that had long since stopped being individual voices and had become something more like weather. She'd stopped hearing it as sound and started feeling it as pressure, not on her chest or her arm, but somewhere less specific, some place inside where the body registers the size of a moment before the mind catches up. 5-2. 3 outs. That was all the math there was. The first batter of the ninth was a left-handed hitter named Cole Davenport, a contact specialist from a program in Tennessee, shorter than the others, with a stance so quiet and compact that he looked almost lazy in the box until the ball was in the air, and then suddenly he was everywhere. Coaches called his type the hardest to pitch to because there was no dramatic tell, no visible aggression to read and use. He simply waited and adjusted and made contact at a rate that made scouts stop writing and just watch. Aaliyah knew his type. Her father had written about contact hitters in the notebook. a full 2 pages, which was more than he'd given to power hitters. Power hitters, he'd written, tell you who they are before the pitch. Contact hitters make you find them. She found him with the first pitch, a 4-seam fastball run inside, designed to jam him and produce a weak pull. He got the barrel on it anyway, which she had half expected, and the ball carried into left center field with a flat, ugly trajectory that landed between 2 outfielders and rolled to the warning track. The runner stopped at second. The crowd gasped, then roared, and then the roar had an anxious edge to it that hadn't been there before. Dugout. Whitmore was standing at the rail, arms folded. He hadn't looked at Riley since the athletic director's visit between innings. Riley was positioned 10 feet away from him, watching the field with the focused attention of someone making calculations. Aaliyah stood on the mound and did not look at either of them. What she felt in that moment was something she recognized, not from this game or this stadium, but from a long time before it. The same sensation she'd felt watching her father in the photographs her mother kept in the hallway. The ones from his last season, when the decisions that would end his career were already being made around him. She'd always thought the expression on his face in those photographs was sadness. Standing on the mound with a runner on second and the game tightening around her, she understood for the first time that it wasn't sadness. It was concentration. The specific, dense concentration of a person refusing to let the size of what they're up against change the quality of what they do. She took the ball from the catcher's return throw and held it. Behind her in the dugout, Preston Webb said something to the player beside him. Something sharp and certain, the default language of someone whose equilibrium has been disturbed. Ethan, 2 seats down, said nothing. He had his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the mound, and he was doing what he'd been doing since the 6th inning, watching Aaliyah with the attention of a person who is learning something. Marcus Doyle stood at the dugout rail. Grant Patterson was beside him. Neither spoke. Aaliyah went into her wind-up and threw a curveball to the next hitter, a right-handed cleanup type who'd been waiting in the on-deck circle with the relaxed patience of someone who'd been in this situation before and had come out on the right side of it. The curveball broke correctly, finished low and away, and he took it for strike 1. She followed it with a fastball up in the zone, the opposite location, opposite velocity, and he was fractionally late. Strike 2. She had him 0-2. The crowd understood the count before the scoreboard updated it, and the volume climbed. And then she shook off the catcher. 3 times. The catcher reset his signal each time, and she shook it off each time, and the dugout and the broadcast and the 12,000 people in the stands watched this with a particular fascination that people give to someone who appears to know something they don't. What she knew was this. The hitter had moved his back foot a half-inch during the second pitch, shifting his weight forward in anticipation of something hard. He was sitting on a fastball to put away, which was what most pitchers threw 0-2, because it was what was expected and what worked often enough to remain the default. He was ready for it. His whole body was organized around meeting it. She threw a slow, arcing curveball that started at his belt and dropped off the bottom of the zone. He swung from his heels at a ball that ended up 6 inches below where he made contact. Strike 3. The crowd's sound changed frequency, a full-throated burst that hit the stadium structure and bounced back into itself. 1 out. Davenport held at second. 1 out. 2 to go. Coach Whitmore took 3 steps toward the mound and then stopped himself. It was not a conscious decision. His feet simply stopped, the way feet do when the mind sends 2 contradictory instructions at the same time. He stood there on the grass between the dugout and the baseline for a moment with his hands at his sides, looking at the mound, and then he turned and walked back. Coach Riley watched this without comment. The 3rd hitter of the inning stepped in, and Aaliyah faced him with the runner still at second and 1 out on the board. He was a tall, patient hitter, long arms, high hands in his stance, the kind of player whose approach was to wait for his pitch and punish it when it arrived. 2 pitches in, she understood he was going to wait all day if she let him. She went to a 2-seam fastball with late arm side run, threw it to the outer half, and he reached for it and hit a sharp grounder to the right side that the second baseman cut off cleanly. The second baseman looked the runner back to second and threw to first. 2 outs. The runner hadn't advanced. The score was still 5-2. The crowd's noise had taken on a layered quality. relief and anticipation, and the building recognition that this was going to come down to one at-bat, one moment, one final thing. Ethan was on his feet now at the dugout rail. He hadn't realized he'd stood up until he was already standing. Aaliyah walked behind the mound and picked up the rosin bag and set it down again. She rolled her right shoulder once, a habitual motion, not a sign of discomfort, and turned to face home plate. The fourth spot in the order was Deshaun Merritt. Of course it was. She'd known it would come back to him. Not because the math had guaranteed it. The lineup could have shuffled, other at-bats could have consumed the outs differently, but because there was a logic to certain games that went beyond their mechanics, a shape that the best ones took where the thing that needed to happen had a way of arranging itself to happen. Her father had believed that. He'd written something in the notebook about it, about how certain games had a grammar of their own, and the pitcher's job was to learn that grammar and speak in it. Deshaun walked to the plate from the on-deck circle without looking at the mound. He did his bat grip routine, 3 slow rotations, weight check, stance set, and then he looked up. He and Aaliyah regarded each other across 60 feet of late afternoon air. "Here we are again," he said, not taunting, just observing. She said nothing. She turned the ball in her glove. The runner on second was taking a cautious lead. 2 outs. A hit here would score him and bring the score to 5-3. Still a deficit, still a problem for Harrington's bats in the bottom of the 9th, but a different atmosphere entirely. A hit here would give the other team momentum and give Aaliyah's critics the footage they'd been waiting for since the announcement had been made. A strikeout here would end the inning, would shift the game's entire narrative, would be, in the context of everything that had brought this afternoon into existence, the completion of something. From the dugout, Ethan's voice, steady, not shouted, but carrying, "You're better than all of us." Pitch like it. She heard it. She didn't turn around, but she heard it, and the hearing of it did something she hadn't expected. Not because it changed what she knew about herself, but because it confirmed that someone else could see it too. That the thing she'd been carrying privately for years was legible. That she hadn't been alone in a room that nobody could enter. That the room had a door and someone had just walked through it. She went into her wind-up. The first pitch came in as a 4-seam fastball at 83 miles per hour, the hardest she'd thrown all day, placed on the outside corner at the knees. Deshaun let it go. The umpire punched his hand out. Strike 1. The crowd built. Deshaun adjusted his grip, took one breath, stepped back in. He was more patient this time than he'd been in his first at-bat in the 5th. The experience of that at-bat was visible in him now. A learned caution. He wasn't going to expand the zone. He wasn't going to reach. He was going to make her throw a strike in a place he could drive. He was correct about all of that, and Aaliyah knew he was correct about all of it. She shook off the catcher once, reset, looked at the runner at second, who had no intention of running on 2 outs and knew it, and then looked back in. She went into her motion and stopped. A balk? No. She'd caught herself before the violation, stepped off the rubber with her back foot, reset. The umpire waved off the objection from the other dugout. Legal. She had the right to step off. She stepped back on the rubber and took a moment that the broadcast cameras and the stadium's 20,000 eyes all watched with the particular patience of people who understand that sometimes the most important action is the one that isn't happening yet. She was reading Deshaun, not just his stance, though that was part of it. She was reading the totality of his at-bat history from this afternoon. The pitches he'd laid off, the ones he'd swung at, the micro-adjustments he'd made each time he stepped out of the box. She was reading the quality of his stillness right now, which was the stillness of someone who had settled into a very specific expectation. He was expecting something breaking. She'd thrown him 2 breaking balls in the previous at-bat. She'd thrown a changeup first to the cleanup hitter. She'd been sequencing with off-speed pitches in the later innings as her fastball command had tightened. The pattern was there for someone intelligent enough to read it. Deshaun was exactly that intelligent. She knew that, which was why the second pitch was a fastball, not the location he was anticipating, not middle out, where a hitter who's sitting off-speed tends to gear up. She threw it middle in, just off the inner half, a location that required him to commit his hands early and didn't leave room for the big barrel through the zone swing he was capable of. He swung. The ball hit the very end of the bat. Not the handle, not the sweet spot, the end, and produced a sharp foul tip that the catcher couldn't hold. Foul ball. But the sound of it, the location of contact, told Aaliyah everything she needed to know about where he'd been when he made the decision. Late. Just barely. But late. Which meant the fastball had surprised him. Which meant the thing long after the final out had been recorded and the celebration had run its first course, people were still in their seats. Not because the event management asked them to stay, but because they weren't ready to leave a place where they'd just watched something that didn't have an easy category yet. Something that would need time to be named properly. They were staying in order to be present for a little longer in the place where it happened, which is what people do when they know they've witnessed something that will matter beyond the day. The broadcast stayed on air 30 minutes past the final pitch. The commentators talked and then stopped talking and then talked again, circling the same territory each time from a slightly different angle, as people do when the thing they're describing is larger than their usual vocabulary for it. History has just been rewritten, one of them said, and the other one let the line sit without adding to it, because sometimes the right response to a true sentence is silence. The Caldwell Sports Group confirmed the $100 million expansion signing within 90 minutes of the final out. The announcement went out through official channels, a press release, a statement from the CEO, and noted, in language that was precise enough to be meaningful and vague enough to be professional, that the performance of the game and its viewership numbers had exceeded projections by a margin that made the decision straightforward. They thanked everyone involved. Their social media team, less restrained, posted a clip of Aaliyah's ninth inning sequence with a single line of text. The future just showed up. It was shared 400,000 times in the first hour. The locker room afterward was loud in the way winning locker rooms always are, a sustained, overlapping noise of people releasing the tension of a long, hard afternoon all at once. Water was being poured on coaches. Someone had a speaker playing at a volume that made conversation impossible unless you were standing close enough to shout. Aaliyah moved through it with the slight displacement of someone for whom the celebration was real, but adjacent, joyful, yes, present in it, yes, but also carrying something that the celebration didn't quite touch. The article was still folded in her back pocket. She hadn't forgotten it for a moment of the ninth inning. She hadn't been carrying it as a burden during the pitching. She'd been carrying it as fuel, which was different. Reporters were waiting in the corridor outside the locker room. She'd been told there were 14 of them. She would go and talk to them. She decided that clearly, without being asked, because the story was real and the story deserved to be spoken in her own words rather than assembled from other people's accounts. But not yet. She sat in the corner of the training room, which was quieter, and held her phone in her lap without looking at it. The notifications were stacked so many deep that the number had become abstract. She let them be abstract for a few more minutes. Marcus Doyle came in and sat across from her without ceremony. He had a water bottle in each hand and passed one to her without comment. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. He nodded, and they sat quietly for a minute, which was the most valuable thing anyone could have given her in that room at that moment. "That last pitch," he said finally. "The change. I knew when you stepped off the second time. I knew you were going to throw it." She looked at him. "Ow." He thought about it. "Because it was the right pitch. And you always throw the right pitch." She didn't say anything to that, but something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that happens just before one, the thing that means more. Ethan found her in the corridor 10 minutes later, on her way to the press area. He fell in a step beside her without being invited, which felt, at this point, like the natural thing. "That sequence," he said. "The step off, the fastball, the change. Yeah, that's the smartest at-bat management I've seen at this level." He paused. "I've faced some of the best pitching in the country. I'm not saying it to be generous. I'm saying it because it's true." She glanced at him as they walked. "I spent 2 weeks telling myself you got lucky," he said. "The first time, on the practice field." He looked straight ahead. "I knew by the second pitch that afternoon that it wasn't luck. I just wasn't ready to say it." "I know," she said. He nodded. "I have a long off-season to think about the things I wasn't ready to say." It wasn't absolution. She hadn't asked for it. What it was honest, the kind of honest that cost something and that she could respect because she understood what honesty cost. "You'll be a good professional," she said. "When you get there." He looked at her. "You're going to get there first," he said. And then, almost as an afterthought, "I think you already are." They reached the corridor junction where her route went right toward the press area and his went left toward the team exit. They stopped. "Go finish it," he said. She turned right. The press conference lasted 40 minutes, and she answered every question put to her. She answered them in the same calm, direct language she'd used all day, not performing composure, just possessing it, which is different, and which the cameras captured in a way that performance never would have. When a reporter asked about the article, about her father, about what she'd learned today and what it meant, she was quiet for a moment. The room got quieter with her. "My father was a better pitcher than anyone in this building ever let him be," she said. "That's the part one need people to understand first. Everything else is secondary to that." She paused. "He taught me everything I know about pitching." She stood on the rubber and faced the empty plate and held a baseball in her right hand. The ball from the ninth inning, which the catcher had tracked down in the chaos of the celebration and pressed in her hand without a word, understanding that it was the kind of object that needed to stay with the person who'd earned it. She turned it over once, felt the seams, found the grip her father had first showed her, index and middle fingers across the narrow seams, pressure, even thumb underneath. She stood there for a long time. The field was quiet the way fields are when no game is happening, a generous, unhurried quiet that had room in it for everything. She set the ball down on the rubber, placed it carefully, deliberately, the way you place something that represents more than its own physical fact. Stepped back, looked at it for a moment. The late light caught the ball's surface and made it bright against the dark dirt of the mound. "3 pitches," she said quietly. "Not to the field, not to the light, not to the empty bleachers. Just like you taught me." She stood there until the light went all the way down. Then she turned and walked off the field, leaving the ball where she'd placed it, on the rubber of her father's mound, on an afternoon that was both an ending and not one at all. The $100 million deal was signed. The expansion went through. Aaliyah's name was in every conversation that mattered. Programs, scouts, officials who had been watching from a careful distance and were no longer being careful or distant. Coach Riley accepted a new position that gave him the authority he'd been operating without. Coach Whitmore resigned at the end of the season, quietly, in language that said nothing directly and implied everything indirectly, and the institution accepted his resignation with the relief of people who had needed him to make that decision and had waited long enough. Marcus Doyle started at second base the following spring, having worked himself into the starting lineup over an off-season of the same quiet, meticulous preparation that had defined his time in the margins. Ethan Cole was drafted in the second round, lower than projected, which some people attributed to the afternoon his certainty had been reorganized, but which Ethan himself attributed to pitchers he'd faced that were better than he'd admitted. Aaliyah played every game that followed the way she played the ninth inning of the $100 million game. One pitch at a time, in the language her father had given her, toward the thing on the other side of every moment of doubt and dismissal and deliberate erasure. She carried the notebook everywhere. She always would. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe. There's more where this came from.